The first sound Ethan Pierce heard that bitter February night in 1878 was the thud of something heavy against his porch, followed by a desperate, rasping cough that cut through the howling Wyoming wind like a knife through paper. He bolted upright from his chair near the fireplace, the book he had been reading tumbling to the floor, and grabbed his rifle from above the mantel before crossing to the door. Living alone on a cattle ranch 15 miles outside of Hot Springs meant trouble could arrive at any hour, and a man learned quickly to greet the unexpected with caution. When he yanked open the heavy wooden door, rifle at the ready, the blast of freezing air took his breath away. But it was the sight before him that stopped his heart entirely. Crumpled against the weathered planks of his porch was a woman, her clothes torn and soaked through, her dark hair matted with ice crystals, her lips blue with cold. Her eyes fluttered open as the light from his doorway fell across her face, and he saw terror mixed with desperate hope in those pale green depths. "Please," she whispered, the single word nearly lost in the shrieking wind. "Please help me." Ethan dropped the rifle immediately and scooped her into his arms, shocked by how light she felt, how violently she trembled against his chest. He kicked the door shut behind them and carried her straight to the fireplace, laying her down on the thick bearskin rug before the flames. Her teeth chattered so hard he could hear them clicking together, and when he touched her forehead, her skin felt like ice beneath his calloused fingers. "What in God's name happened to you?" he muttered, already moving to strip away her wet clothing. There was no time for modesty or propriety, not when hypothermia could kill her within the hour. He worked quickly, peeling off her sodden dress, her thin petticoats, her ruined boots. Everything was frozen stiff or soaked through. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then fed more wood to the fire until it roared with fierce heat. She had stopped shaking enough to speak, though her words came in fragments. "Stagecoach. Attacked. They killed everyone. I ran, been walking for days." His blood rang cold at the thought of what she had endured. The Wyoming Territory in winter was unforgiving enough without being lost and alone. How many days? 3, maybe 4. Lost track. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with his warmest nightshirt and wool socks. "Can you sit up? I need you to get into dry clothes." She nodded, though her movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. He helped her, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible while still ensuring she was properly dressed. Once she was decent, he lifted her into his arms again and carried her to the leather chair closest to the fire, settling her there before wrapping another blanket around her shoulders. "I am going to make you something warm to drink," he said. "Do not move." In his small kitchen, he heated milk on the stove and added honey, cinnamon, and a splash of whiskey. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he stirred. The woman in his living room could have died on his porch if he had been asleep, if the wind had carried her cough in another direction, if he had decided to check on the horses in the barn instead of reading by the fire. The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. When he returned with the steaming mug, he found her staring into the flames with an expression of profound exhaustion. Up close, with the firelight playing across her features, he could see she was younger than he had first thought, probably in her early 20s. Dark bruises shadowed her eyes and scratches marked her pale skin, but there was something about the set of her jaw that spoke of strength. "Here, drink this slowly," he instructed, pressing the warm mug into her hands and guiding it to her lips. She took a tentative sip, then another, and gradually some color began to return to her face. "Thank you," she whispered after several minutes of silence. "You saved my life. What is your name, Julia?" "Julia Vaughn." "I am Ethan Pierce. This is my ranch." He pulled up a wooden chair and sat facing her, his forearms resting on his knees. You said the stagecoach was attacked. By whom? Her hands tightened around the mug, and he saw fear flash across her face again. Men with bandanas covering their faces, 4 of them, maybe 5. They shot the driver first, then the guard. The other passengers tried to fight, but they did not have a chance. Her voice broke. There was a family, a mother and father with their little boy. The bandits shot them all. Ethan felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and fierce. Stagecoach robberies were common enough in the territory, but most outlaws had enough sense to let the passengers live. Murder brought the law down hard. And you escaped. I jumped out the back when they were distracted with the strongbox, ran into the trees. They fired some shots after me, but it was getting dark, and I guess they decided I was not worth chasing. She met his eyes. I have been walking ever since. I knew Hot Springs was somewhere in this direction, but everything looks the same in the snow. You are lucky you found this place. Another few miles and you would have frozen to death in the open country. I know. She took another sip of the warm milk, and he noticed her hands had stopped shaking. I cannot thank you enough for taking me in. Most men would have turned away a strange woman appearing out of nowhere. Ethan shook his head. No decent man would leave another human being to die in the cold. You will stay here until you are well enough to travel, and then I will take you into Hot Springs myself. Something flickered in her expression, an emotion he could not quite read. You are very kind, Mr. Pierce. Just Ethan. And kindness has nothing to do with basic human decency. Over the next hour, he warmed soup on the stove and watched as Julia ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had not had proper food in days. He found himself studying her when she was not looking, noticing small details. The way her hair, now drying by the fire, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. The determined set of her mouth even in exhaustion. The way she held herself with a certain dignity despite everything she had endured. He had been alone on this ranch for 3 years, ever since his father died and left him the property. At 32, Ethan had grown accustomed to solitude, to the rhythms of cattle and horses and the changing seasons. He spoke to his hands during the day and spent his evenings raiding or maintaining the ranch. He had convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price of the life he had chosen. But having Julia in his home, even under these circumstances, made him suddenly aware of how quiet the ranch had been, how empty. The sound of another person breathing, moving, existing in his space felt both foreign and strangely right. You should rest, he said finally, when she had finished the soup and her eyelids were growing heavy. You can have my bed. I will sleep out here by the fire. I cannot take your bed, Julia protested, but he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. You can and you will. You have been through hell and you need proper rest. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on. No arguments. She took his hand, her fingers small and cold in his, and let him help her to her feet. He guided her to his bedroom, a simple space with a sturdy bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. The sheets were clean, and he added extra blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed. If you need anything during the night, just call out. I will hear you, he said from the doorway. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why are you being so kind to me? You do not even know me. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, considering his answer. Maybe because I know what it is like to need help and not have anyone to ask. Maybe because it is the right thing to do. Does it matter? I suppose not. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. But I will remember this kindness, Ethan Pierce, however long I live. He nodded and pulled the door partially closed, leaving it open just enough that he would hear if she called. Then he returned to the living room, added more wood to the fire, and settled into his chair with one of the blankets she had not needed. Sleep did not come easily. His mind kept returning to the woman in his bed, to the story she had told, to the vulnerability and strength he had seen in equal measure on her face. When dawn broke over the Wyoming plains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Ethan was already up and making coffee. He had slept fitfully, waking at every sound, alert for any sign that Julia needed assistance. But the ranch had remained quiet except for the usual morning sounds of the animals stirring in the barn. He was frying bacon when he heard her footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Julia standing in the doorway of the bedroom, wearing his nightshirt which hung nearly to her ankles, her hair loose around her shoulders. In the morning light, with rest and warmth having restored some vitality to her features, he was struck by how beautiful she was. "Good morning," she said softly. "Something smells wonderful, just bacon and eggs, nothing fancy." He gestured to the table. "Sit. Coffee, please." She settled into one of the chairs, tucking her feet under her. "I cannot remember the last time I slept so well. Your bed is very comfortable. How are you feeling? Any numbness in your fingers or toes?" She flexed her hands experimentally. "No. Everything seems to be working properly. You got to me in time." He poured her a cup of coffee and set it before her, then returned to the stove to finish cooking. "I was thinking I should ride into Hot Springs today, let the sheriff know what happened. They need to know about the attack and about you." Julia's expression darkened. "Do you think they will find the men who did it?" "Hard to say. If they are smart, they will be long gone by now. But the law should still know." He plated the food and brought it to the table, sitting across from her. "Do you have family somewhere? People who will be worried about you?" She shook her head, and he saw sadness cross her face. "No family. I was traveling to Hot Springs to take a position as a teacher. The school board there hired me based on letters of reference. Everything I owned was in my trunk on that stagecoach. I am sorry. It is just things." She picked up her fork and began to eat. "Things can be replaced. Those people who died cannot. I keep thinking about that little boy. He was maybe 6 years old with red hair and freckles. He was so excited about something his mother had promised him when they arrived, and now he is gone, just like that." Ethan reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The gesture was instinctive, meant to comfort, but the moment his skin touched hers, something electric passed between them. Julia looked up, meeting his eyes, and he saw his own surprise reflected there. He pulled his hand back slowly, uncertain. "Sorry," he muttered. You have been through a terrible thing. Do not apologize." Her voice was quiet but steady. "It is nice to be reminded that there is still kindness in the world, that there are still good people." They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and afterward, Ethan showed Julia where he kept spare clothes that might fit her. They had belonged to his younger sister who had visited years ago, before she married and moved to California. The dress was simple blue cotton, a bit worn but clean and serviceable. Julia took it gratefully and disappeared into the bedroom to change. When she emerged, transformed from the half-frozen wraith of the night before into a proper young woman, Ethan felt his heart do an unexpected somersault in his chest. He cleared his throat and looked away, confused by his reaction. He barely knew this woman. She had appeared on his porch less than 12 hours ago. There was no reason for him to be feeling anything beyond simple compassion for someone in need. "I am going to go check on the cattle and horses," he announced, grabbing his coat from the hook by the door. "Make yourself at home. There are books on the shelf if you want something to read. And please stay inside where it is warm." Julia smiled, and it transformed her face completely. "I have no intention of going back out into that cold, but Ethan, when you go into town, may I come with you? I should report what happened myself, and I need to contact the school board about my position." He hesitated. The ride to Hot Springs would take a few hours each way, and the temperature was still well below freezing. But she was right. She needed to handle these matters herself. "If you are up for it, we can take the wagon and bundle you up warm. I will not go until this afternoon, though. Give you more time to recover." "Thank you." Ethan spent the morning doing his usual chores, feeding the cattle, checking the water troughs, inspecting the horses. He had 4 ranch hands who worked for him, but they had taken time off to visit family in Cheyenne and would not be back for another week. Normally, he enjoyed these periods of complete solitude, the simplicity of working with his animals and the land. But today his mind kept drifting back to the woman in his house, to the way she had looked at him over breakfast, to the strange feeling that had passed between them when their hands touched. He was being ridiculous. She was a woman in trouble who needed help, nothing more. Once he got her safely to Hot Springs and ensured she was properly settled, she would continue with her life, and he would return to his ranch and his solitude. That was how it had to be. But when he returned to the house at midday and found Julia had tidied his kitchen and living room, had washed the dishes and swept the floors and generally brought a sense of order to his bachelor existence, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "You did not need to do all this," he said, hanging his coat and hat on their hooks. Julia looked up from where she was folding one of the blankets. "I wanted to. You have done so much for me. It is the least I can offer in return. Still, you should be resting." "I have rested enough." Honestly, keeping busy helps. When I am not doing anything, my mind goes back to the stagecoach, to what happened. She set the folded blanket on the chair. Staying active keeps the memories at bay. Ethan understood that sentiment better than she knew. After his father died, he had worked himself nearly to exhaustion every day for months, anything to avoid sitting still with his grief. "I know what you mean, but do not overdo it. You were half frozen last night." They ate a simple lunch of bread and cheese, and then Ethan hitched his 2 strongest horses to the wagon and helped Julia up onto the bench seat, wrapping her in heavy blankets and furs until she was practically cocooned. The ride to Hot Springs was cold and bumpy, following rutted roads through snow-covered rangeland, but Julia did not complain once. Instead, she asked him questions about the ranch, about his life, about Wyoming. He found himself talking more than he had in months, telling her about growing up on this land, about learning the cattle business from his father, about the challenges of running a ranch alone. She listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, and he discovered that she was educated and intelligent, with a quick wit that made him smile. "So you really came all the way from Pennsylvania to teach in a town you had never seen?" he asked as they neared Hot Springs. "I did. After my parents died last year, there was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia, and I had always wanted to see the West. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Hot Springs, it seemed like fate." She glanced at him, "Though I admit my arrival was rather more dramatic than I had planned. The students will probably be disappointed. You do not have a tale of being rescued by a band of friendly Indians or discovering gold in a mountain stream." Julia laughed, a sound like music that made something in Ethan's chest expand. "Oh, I think the tale of the kind rancher who found me freezing on his porch and saved my life will be quite sufficient. You are my hero, Ethan Pierce, whether you want to be or not." He felt heat rise to his face and was grateful for the cold wind that gave him an excuse for his reddened cheeks. "I am no hero, just a man who did what anyone would do." "Not anyone. I have learned that the hard way." Her voice grew serious. "There is a reason I will never forget your kindness." Hot Springs was a typical Wyoming town, with a main street lined with wooden buildings, a handful of saloons, a general store, a church, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. Ethan pulled the wagon up outside the sheriff's office, a squat building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. He helped Julia down, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow as they navigated the icy boardwalk. Sheriff Tom Garrett was a weathered man in his 50s with a thick gray mustache and shrewd eyes. He looked up from his desk when they entered, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp attention when Julia began to tell her story. "The Centerville stage," he said when she finished, leaning back in his chair. "We wondered why it never arrived. Usually that coach runs like clockwork." He pulled out a sheet of paper and began making notes. "Can you describe these men?" Julia did her best, but as she had told Ethan, the bandits had worn bandanas and it had been growing dark. She could offer little beyond general builds and the fact that they rode dark horses. Garrett wrote it all down anyway, his expression grim. "I will wire the territorial marshal's office, let them know what happened, and I will get a group together to ride out and find the stagecoach, recover the bodies for proper burial." He looked at Julia with something approaching sympathy. "You are lucky to be alive, Miss Vaughn. I know. If not for Mr. Pierce, I would not be." Garrett's gaze shifted to Ethan, and there was a knowing look in his eyes that made Ethan uncomfortable. "That's so. Well, Ethan has always been one of the good ones. You are in good hands, Miss Vaughn." From the sheriff's office, they went to the small schoolhouse at the edge of town, where the school board chairman, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, nearly fell over himself with relief when Julia introduced herself. "We thought you were dead," he exclaimed, ushering them into the small building that smelled of chalk and wood polish. "When the stage did not arrive and we heard it had gone missing, we feared the worst." Julia explained what had happened, though she left out the more gruesome details. Henderson listened with growing horror, shaking his head. "Terrible, just terrible, but thank God you survived, and thank you, Mr. Pierce, for aiding our teacher in her time of need." "When would you like me to start?" Julia asked, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. Henderson blinked. "Start? My dear girl, you have been through a trauma. Surely you need time to recover." "Work will help me recover," Julia said firmly, and Ethan heard the same determination in her voice that he had recognized the night before. "I came here to teach. I would like to begin as soon as possible." "Well, if you are certain. The children have been without a teacher for 2 months since Miss Adams left to get married. They could certainly use the instruction." Henderson rubbed his chin. "But where will you stay?" "We had arranged lodgings for you at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, but she has rented your room to someone else after we thought you would not be coming." Ethan spoke before he fully considered his words. "She can stay at my ranch until other arrangements can be made. I have the room, and it is the least I can do given everything she has been through." Julia turned to look at him, surprise evident on her face. Henderson's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Mr. Pierce, that is very generous, but a young unmarried woman staying at the home of an unmarried man, well, people will talk." "Let them talk," Ethan said, more sharply than he intended. "Miss Vaughn needs a safe place to stay, and I am offering one, unless you have a better solution." Henderson floundered for a moment, then sighed. "I will ask around, see if any of the families in town have a spare room, but in the interim, I suppose your arrangement will have to suffice, though I trust you will both be mindful of appearances." "Of course," Julia said quickly. "Mr. Pierce has been nothing but a gentleman. I am grateful for his continued hospitality." They made arrangements for Julia to begin teaching the following Monday, which gave her a few more days to recover and prepare. Then Ethan guided her to the general store, where he insisted on buying her supplies to replace what she had lost. Everything from a proper coat and boots to basic toiletries and a few simple dresses. Julia protested the expense, but he waved her objections away. "Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better," he said as the shopkeeper wrapped the purchases in brown paper. "You can pay me back once you start receiving your salary." "I will," Julia promised. "Every penny, with interest." "I do not want interest. I just want you to have what you need." As they loaded the parcels into the wagon, Julia touched his arm. "Why are you doing all this, Ethan? And please do not say it is just basic decency. This goes beyond that." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the way the afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning it to mahogany silk. "Honestly, I do not know. Maybe because you remind me that there is more to life than cattle and solitude. Maybe because helping you makes me feel like I am doing something that matters." He met her eyes. "Or maybe I just like having you around." Color rose in her cheeks and she smiled. "I like being around too." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the trip into town, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that falls between two people who are beginning to understand each other. Ethan found himself hyper-aware of Julia sitting beside him, of the small space between them on the bench seat, of the way she looked at the landscape, as if memorizing every detail. When they arrived back at the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, Ethan helped Julia down from the wagon and carried her parcels inside. She immediately set about putting things away and starting dinner, while he went to tend to the horses and do the evening feeding. Later, as they sat together by the fire eating the stew Julia had made from supplies in his pantry, Ethan realized this was the most content he had felt in years. There was something deeply right about sharing his home with her, about having someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who looked at him with warmth and growing trust. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, catching him staring at her over his bowl. "I am thinking that my house feels different with you in it, in a good way." She set down her spoon. "It feels different to me too, like a home instead of just a place to sleep." She hesitated, then continued. "I have been on my own for a while now since my parents died. I forgot what it was like to feel safe, to feel like someone actually cared if I was warm and fed and well." "I do care," Ethan said quietly. "I know we have only known each other a day, but I do. I know you do. I can see it in everything you do, every kindness you show me." Julia looked down at her hands. "It scares me a little, to be honest." "Why?" "Because I could get used to this, to you, and I know this is temporary. Once the school board finds me permanent lodgings, I will move into town, and you will go back to your life here, and this will just be a strange few days we both remember." Ethan reached across the small table and took her hand, no hesitation this time. "What if it does not have to be temporary? What if we found a way to make it more?" Julia's eyes widened. "Ethan, we have known each other one day. I know, and maybe I am crazy for even suggesting this, but I have been alone for 3 years, Julia. 3 years of convincing myself I was fine, that I did not need anyone. And then you appeared on my porch and suddenly I realized how wrong I was. I do need someone. I need you. You do not know me, not really. Then let me get to know you. Stay here, not just until they find you a room in town, but longer. Give us time to figure out what this is between us." Julia squeezed his hand and he could see emotions warring on her face. Hope, fear, longing, caution. "What about what Mr. Henderson said, about people talking?" "I do not care what people say, but if it worries you, we can make it proper. You can have my bedroom, I will sleep in the barn loft. The hands will be back next week, so there will be other people around. We can be as respectable as you need to be." "It is not about being respectable," Julia said softly. "It is about not wanting to be hurt. I have lost everyone I ever cared about, Ethan. My parents, my friends back east, the people on that stagecoach. I do not know if I can risk my heart again. He understood that fear intimately. After his father died and his sister moved away and he had retreated into solitude, he had told himself it was safer not to let anyone close. Safer not to care too much, but safe was also lonely, and he was tired of being lonely. I cannot promise you will never be hurt, he said honestly, but I can promise I will do everything in my power to protect your heart. And I can promise that what I am feeling is real, even if it is happening fast. Julia was quiet for a long moment, searching his face. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, I will stay. Not forever, not yet. But long enough for us to see if this is real or just the intensity of the circumstances that brought us together. Relief and joy flooded through Ethan, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Thank you. You will not regret this. I hope not, she whispered. But she was smiling. Over the next week, they fell into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Julia would wake early and make breakfast while Ethan did the morning chores. Then she would spend a few hours preparing lessons for her teaching position, reviewing the materials Mr. Henderson had provided and organizing her thoughts. Ethan would work the ranch, and in the afternoons, they would often take walks together, bundled against the cold, as he showed her the property and told her stories about growing up here. The ranch hands returned on the fourth day, 4 weathered men who had worked for Ethan's father and stayed on after his death. They were initially surprised to find a woman in residence, but Ethan explained the situation and made it clear that Julia was to be treated with the utmost respect. To their credit, the men accepted her presence without question, and even seemed pleased that their boss had someone to share his home with. In the evenings, Ethan and Julia would sit by the fire and talk for hours. He learned that she had been a teacher in Philadelphia before her parents died, that she loved books and music, and had always dreamed of adventure. She learned that he had once wanted to be a doctor, but had stayed to help his father with the ranch, that he played the guitar though he claimed to be terrible at it, that he secretly loved poetry though he had never admitted that to anyone. They also learned the smaller things about each other. That Julia liked her coffee with just a touch of sugar, that Ethan always checked the lock on the door twice before bed, that Julia hummed while she cooked, that Ethan had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking hard about something. And through it all, the attraction between them grew stronger. Ethan found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to touch her hand or shoulder in passing, to hear her laugh. Julia would catch him watching her and would blush but never looked away. The air between them seemed to crackle with possibility, with the promise of something more. On the night before Julia was to start teaching, they sat together on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars wheel overhead in the clear winter sky. The vastness of the Wyoming night was humbling, and Ethan felt Julia shiver beside him, though he suspected it was from awe rather than cold. "It is so beautiful here," she murmured. "So big and wild and free. I understand why you love this land. It can be harsh too, unforgiving. But yes, it gets into your blood." He turned to look at her profile, limned in starlight. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" "A little. I have taught before, but never in a one-room schoolhouse with students of all ages, and never after nearly dying in the wilderness." She laughed softly. "I suppose that is not the kind of thing that builds confidence. The children will love you. You are smart and kind and patient. What more could they want in a teacher?" Julia turned to face him, and in the darkness, her eyes were luminous. "You always know exactly what to say to make me feel better. How do you do that?" "Maybe because I pay attention, because you matter to me." He reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Julia, I know we agreed to take things slow to see if what we are feeling is real, but I need you to know that for me it is already real. I am falling for you." Hard. Her breath caught and he could see the rapid pulse beating at her throat. "Ethan, you do not have to say anything. I just needed you to know." But Julia shook her head. "No, you do not understand. I was going to say that I am falling for you too. I have been trying to talk myself out of it, telling myself it is too fast, too intense, that I should be more careful, but my heart does not seem to care about logic." Ethan's own heart was hammering against his ribs. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned closer. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered. "Please, yes." Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. But then Julia's hand came up to cup the back of his neck, and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and hungry. Ethan pulled her closer, blankets and propriety forgotten, losing himself in the taste of her, the feel of her body against his, the small sound she made in the back of her throat. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that since the morning after you arrived." "Only since then?" Julia's voice was teasing, breathless. "I have been wanting it since I woke up in your bed and realized you had given up your comfort for mine. We are both fools then, waiting this long." They kissed again, and it was only when the cold finally became too much to ignore that they retreated inside. Ethan walked Julia to the bedroom door and they stood there for a long moment, neither wanting to part. "Good night, Julia," Ethan said finally, though it cost him to step back. "Good night, Ethan." She touched his face gently. "Thank you for everything." That night, lying in his bedroll by the fire, Ethan could not sleep for the joy singing through his veins. For years he had been convinced that love was something that had passed him by, that he was destined for a life of solitude. But Julia had changed everything. She had crashed into his life in the most dramatic way possible, and in just over a week, she had become as essential to him as breathing. The next morning, Ethan drove Julia into Hot Springs for her first day of teaching. She was nervous, he could tell, but excitement sparkled in her eyes as he helped her down from the wagon in front of the schoolhouse. A gaggle of children was already waiting, bundled in their winter clothes, watching the new teacher with undisguised curiosity. "You will be wonderful," Ethan murmured, squeezing her hand. "Will you come get me this afternoon? Wild horses could not keep me away." He watched as she climbed the schoolhouse steps and turned to greet her students, her voice clear and warm as she introduced herself. Then, reluctantly, he climbed back into the wagon and headed to the general store to pick up supplies. He had ranch work to do, but he found it difficult to focus on anything except the clock, counting the hours until he could see Julia again. When he returned to collect her that afternoon, he found her surrounded by several of the students, all talking at once, showing her drawings and asking questions. Her face was flushed and happy, and when she spotted him, her smile grew even brighter. She said goodbye to the children and hurried to the wagon, practically bouncing with excitement. "How was it?" Ethan asked as they started back toward the ranch. "It was wonderful. The children are so eager to learn, even the older ones, and they had so many questions about everything. I think this is going to be even better than I hoped." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Ethan found himself grinning as she recounted stories from her day. This was how it could be, he thought. Coming into town each day, bringing her home each evening, sharing their lives. The vision was so clear and so right that it almost took his breath away. Over the following weeks, they settled into this new routine. Ethan would drive Julia to the schoolhouse each morning and pick her up each afternoon. They would return to the ranch, work on their respective tasks, and then spend the evenings together. And with each passing day, their connection deepened. There were more kisses, stolen in quiet moments, embraces that lasted longer than strictly necessary, looks that spoke volumes. They were courting, though neither had used that word explicitly, and everyone in Hot Springs seemed to know it. Ethan heard the whispers in town, saw the knowing glances, but he did not care. He was too happy, too consumed with Julia to worry about gossip. But not everyone was pleased with the development. One cold March afternoon, as Ethan waited outside the schoolhouse for Julia, he was approached by a man he recognized as Charles Morrison, owner of one of the larger ranches outside Hot Springs. Morrison was in his 50s, wealthy, and had buried 2 wives already. "Pierce," Morrison said, his tone clipped, "I hear you have been harboring our new schoolteacher at your ranch. Miss Vaughn is staying with me temporarily, yes. It is all perfectly proper." "Proper," Morrison snorted. "Nothing proper about an unmarried man and woman living under the same roof. The school board is concerned. Some of the parents are concerned." Ethan felt anger spark in his chest. "Concerned about what? That I saved her life, that I gave her shelter when she needed it." "Concerned about her reputation, and yours, though I imagine you care less about that." Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I have a proposition. I have a large house with plenty of room. Miss Vaughn could come stay with me. I have a housekeeper, so everything would be above board. And it would solve the problem of appearances." "That is generous," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "but Miss Vaughn is happy where she is. Have you asked her, or are you making decisions for her?" Morrison's smile was smug. "She is a lovely young woman, Pierce, smart and educated. She deserves better than a struggling ranch, and a man who cannot even afford proper help most of the year." Before Ethan could respond, the schoolhouse door opened and Julia emerged, chatting with 2 of the mothers who had come to collect their children. When she spotted Ethan, she said her goodbyes and hurried over, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Morrison tipped his hat. "Miss Vaughn, Charles Morrison. I own the Diamond M Ranch. I was just telling Pierce here that you would be welcome to stay at my home if you need more appropriate lodgings. I have plenty of space, and my housekeeper would be delighted to have another woman in the house." Julia glanced between the 2 men, and Ethan could see her sharp mind working. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, but I am quite content with my current situation." "Are you certain? I would hate for your reputation to suffer because of a lack of options." "My reputation is my own concern," Julia said calmly, but Ethan heard steel beneath the polite words. "And I assure you, Mr. Pierce has been nothing but a gentleman. Now, if you will excuse us, we should be getting back to the ranch. Good day, Mr. Morrison." She took Ethan's arm and steered him toward the wagon, not looking back. Once they were out of earshot, she let out a frustrated breath. "What was that about? Morrison thinks he can take better care of you than I can. He is probably right." Julia stopped walking and turned to face him. "Ethan Pierce, do not you dare start doubting yourself because of that pompous man. I do not care about his big house or his money. I care about you. People are talking, Julia, about us living together. Let them talk, unless—" she bit her lip. "Unless you are getting tired of me staying with you. If that is the case, I understand. I can find somewhere else to live." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he intended. "No, I do not want you to leave, ever, but I do not want you to suffer because of me either." Julia reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Then stop worrying about what other people think and tell me what you want." Ethan covered her hands with his. "I want you, not just as someone staying at my ranch, but as a part of my life. Permanently." He took a deep breath, knowing he was about to take the biggest risk of his life. Julia Vaughn, I know we have only known each other a few weeks. I know this is fast and probably crazy, but I love you. I am in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me. Tears sprang to Julia's eyes, but she was smiling. Yes, yes, I will have you, because I love you too, Ethan. I think I have loved you since the night you carried me inside and wrapped me in blankets and refused to let me freeze. You saved my life in more ways than one. He kissed her right there on the main street of Hot Springs, not caring who saw, pouring all his love and hope and joy into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both laughing breathlessly, Ethan took her hand. Will you marry me, properly? Is that a proposal? A clumsy one, maybe. I do not have a ring or flowers or any of the romantic things I should have prepared. I do not need those things. Julia squeezed his hand. But yes, Ethan Pierce, I will marry you. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Hot Springs. Julia wore a new dress that Ethan insisted on buying from the dressmaker in town, a soft cream color that made her eyes luminous. Ethan wore his best suit, the one he had not worn since his father's funeral, and tried not to fidget nervously as the preacher led them through their vows. The church was full, despite the short notice. The school board and many of the parents of Julia's students attended, along with Ethan's ranch hands and various townsfolk. Even Sheriff Garrett was there, looking pleased. Charles Morrison was notably absent, which suited Ethan just fine. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Ethan he could kiss his bride, Ethan took Julia in his arms and kissed her with all the love in his heart. The congregation applauded, and Julia laughed against his lips, her joy infectious. They held a small reception at the ranch, with tables set up in the barn which had been cleared and decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter and more food than seemed possible. Ethan danced with his new wife, holding her close, marveling at how his life had changed so completely in such a short time. Happy, Julia murmured as they swayed to the music. Happier than I ever thought possible. Me too. She rested her head on his shoulder. Though I keep thinking about that night you found me on your porch. If I had gone a different direction, if you had not been home, if the wind had blown differently, we might never have met. But we did meet, and I do not intend to spend our marriage dwelling on what might have been. Only on what is. What is, Julia repeated softly. What is a husband who loves me, a home that feels right, a life I never dared to dream I could have? She looked up at him. You gave me all of that, Ethan. You gave it to me too. I was just too stubborn to admit I needed it before you came along. That night, after all the guests had departed and the ranch was quiet, Ethan carried Julia over the threshold of their bedroom, the same room where she had slept that first night. But now it was their room, their bed, their life together. He set her down gently and framed her face with his hands, taking a moment to simply look at her. I love you, Julia Pierce. Her smile could have lit up the darkest night. I love you too. Now stop looking at me like that and kiss me, husband. He did, and their wedding night was everything it should be, tender and passionate and full of the joy of two people who had found each other against all odds. In the months that followed, they built a life together that felt both extraordinary and beautifully ordinary. Julia continued teaching, quickly becoming beloved by her students and respected by the community. Ethan worked the ranch with his hands and slowly began to expand his herd, his dreams growing now that he had someone to share them with. They made improvements to the house, adding a proper bedroom for guests and a study where Julia could work on her lessons and Ethan could handle the ranch accounts. They planted a garden that Julia tended with enthusiasm, even though half her plants did not survive the harsh Wyoming weather. They adopted a dog, a gangly mutt that followed Julia everywhere and slept at the foot of their bed, and through it all, their love continued to deepen. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. They learned how to argue and make up, how to support each other through difficult days, how to celebrate the small victories. They learned that love was not just the passionate kisses and heated embraces, though there was plenty of that. It was also Julia bringing Ethan coffee while he worked on the books late at night. It was Ethan rubbing Julia's feet after a long day of teaching. It was the quiet moments of simply being together. When summer came and brought with it a brutal heat wave, Ethan surprised Julia by taking her on a trip to the mountains for a few days, borrowing a cabin from a friend. They spent their days hiking and their evenings sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and Julia told him it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. In August, Julia discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan over breakfast one morning, her hands shaking slightly as she set down her coffee cup and said, "I have something to tell you." Ethan looked up from his eggs, immediately alert to the nervousness in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine. Better than fine, actually." She took his hand. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Ethan could not speak, could barely breathe. Then he was out of his chair and pulling her into his arms, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. "A baby. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Julia asked, her voice muffled against his chest. He pulled back to look at her, and she could see tears in his eyes. "Happy, Julia, I am beyond happy. I am overwhelmed, terrified. Completely in love with you and this baby we have not even met yet." She laughed, crying a little herself. "Good. Because I am all of those things too." The pregnancy was not easy. Julia suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and Ethan fretted over her constantly, much to her amused exasperation. He wanted her to stop teaching, but she refused, insisting she was perfectly capable of managing a classroom while pregnant. They compromised on her cutting back her hours in the last few months. As Julia's belly grew, Ethan found himself in awe of the changes in her body, of the life growing inside her. He would lay his hand on her stomach and feel their baby kick, and each time it filled him with wonder. They spent evenings discussing names, planning how they would convert one of the spare rooms into a nursery, dreaming about who their child would be. In late March of 1879, just over a year after Julia had stumbled onto Ethan's porch, she went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that lasted through the night and into the next morning. Ethan stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement even when his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Ethan felt his knees go weak with relief and love. The doctor placed the baby in Julia's arms, and she looked down at their child with an expression of such profound tenderness that Ethan felt his heart might burst. "He is perfect," Julia whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand, which immediately wrapped around her finger. "He is," Ethan agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed and putting his arm around his wife. "What should we name him?" They had discussed many names, but looking at their son, Julia said, "Henry. Henry Samuel Pierce, after my father and yours." "Henry," Ethan repeated, testing it out. "I like it. Hello, Henry. Welcome to the world, son." Fatherhood transformed Ethan in ways he had not expected. He had always been a serious man, focused on work and responsibility. But Henry brought out a playful side he had not known he possessed. He would spend hours just watching his son sleep, amazed by the tiny fingernails, the perfect little nose, the way Henry would scrunch up his face when he dreamed. Julia returned to teaching part-time when Henry was 3 months old, and they hired a young woman from town named Sarah to help with the baby and the house. Sarah was excellent with Henry, but Ethan still found himself rushing through his work so he could get back to the house and spend time with his son. By Henry's first birthday, Julia was pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier, though she was more tired with an active toddler to chase. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, was born in December of 1880, a beautiful baby with Julia's dark hair and Ethan's gray eyes. Two children, Ethan marveled, holding Margaret while Henry toddled around the room, chattering in his half-formed words. Two perfect children. Are you happy? Julia asked from the bed, watching her family with contentment. I did not think it was possible to be this happy. Sometimes I wake up and I am afraid I will realize this is all a dream. It is not a dream. Julia held out her hand and he came to sit beside her, careful not to jostle the sleeping baby in his arms. This is our life, the one we built together. As the children grew, the ranch prospered. Ethan's reputation as a fair and honest cattleman spread, and he began to do more business, selling his stock across the territory and even into neighboring states. He hired more hands and expanded his grazing land, always careful to manage his growth sustainably. Julia continued teaching, beloved by generations of students. She started a small lending library at the school and organized community events that brought the people of Hot Springs together. She was active in the church and volunteered to help new families settling in the area, always remembering what it had been like to be alone and lost. Their home was filled with laughter and love. Henry grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and spent every spare moment following his father around, asking questions about the cattle and the horses. Margaret was her mother's daughter, clever and curious, with a gift for reading that had Julia convinced she would grow up to be a writer or a teacher. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Julia with a gift. He had hired a carpenter to build a covered porch that wrapped around the entire front of the house, with a swing where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the plains. You remember the first night we sat on the porch together? Ethan asked as they sat on the new swing, the children playing in the yard under Sarah's watchful eye. The night you told me you were falling for me, the night we first kissed. Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. I remember everything about that night. I was terrified. I had no idea if you felt the same way. I did, though. I think I fell in love with you the moment I woke up and realized you had sacrificed your own comfort to take care of me. She turned to look at him. You have been sacrificing for me ever since. That is not sacrifice. That is love. He kissed her forehead. And you have given me far more than I have given you. A home that is truly a home, children, purpose, joy. I was barely living before you came into my life, Julia. Now I feel alive every single day. Years passed with the gentle rhythm of family life. There were hard times, certainly. A drought one year that tested Ethan's resources and patience. An illness that swept through Hot Springs and left Henry seriously ill for weeks, with Ethan and Julia taking turns sitting up with him through long, frightening nights. The death of one of the old ranch hands who had been like an uncle to Ethan. But the good times far outnumbered the bad. Henry's first successful cattle drive at age 14, where he proved himself as capable as any of the men. Margaret winning a statewide essay contest when she was 12, her proud parents framing the award on the wall. The birth of their 3rd child, another son they named Daniel, when Ethan was 40 and Julia was 31. On the 10th anniversary of the night Julia had appeared on his porch, Ethan woke before dawn and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his wife. He made coffee and stood on their porch, watching the sun rise over the land he loved, thinking about the incredible journey his life had taken. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find Julia, wrapped in a quilt, coming to join him. She slipped her arms around his waist and rested her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky I am. How different my life would be if you had not found your way to my door that night." Julia moved to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. "I was thinking about that too, about how lost I was, how alone. And then there you were, this lonely rancher who opened his door and his heart to a frozen stranger. Not so lonely anymore. No, not lonely at all." They stood together as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, the same way they had stood together through all the joys and sorrows of the past decade. Behind them, they could hear their children beginning to stir, the sounds of their family waking. The ranch hands would arrive soon to start the day's work. Students would be waiting for Julia at the schoolhouse. Life would go on in its busy, beautiful way. But for this moment, they just stood together, two people who had found each other in the vast wilderness of the Wyoming Territory and had built a love that would last a lifetime. A rancher who had been alone until he found her shivering on his porch. A woman who had been lost until he warmed her with his fire and then his heart. As the years continued to unfold, Ethan and Julia's love only deepened, aging like fine wine. Their children grew into remarkable adults. Henry took over more and more of the ranch operations as Ethan grew older, proving himself a capable and innovative rancher. He married a sweet-natured girl named Emma from a neighboring ranch, and they gave Ethan and Julia their first grandchildren, twin boys who were the absolute terrors and delights of the Pierce family. Margaret did indeed become a teacher, taking over Julia's position at the schoolhouse when Julia finally retired at age 50. She married a lawyer who had moved to Hot Springs from Denver, and they had 3 daughters who all inherited their mother's love of books and learning. Daniel, the youngest, surprised everyone by developing a passion for medicine. He left Wyoming to attend medical school back east, fulfilling the dream Ethan had once harbored for himself. But Daniel returned to Hot Springs to practice, saying he could not imagine living anywhere else. The circle completed when Daniel married Sarah, the young woman who had helped care for him as a baby, who had grown into a skilled nurse. Ethan and Julia watched all of this with pride and joy, marveling at how their one moment of connection on a frozen February night had rippled out to touch so many lives. The ranch prospered under Henry's management, growing into one of the most successful operations in the territory. The schoolhouse Julia had taught in was expanded and improved, educating generations of children. The town of Hot Springs grew and thrived, and the Pierce family was at the heart of it all. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a grand celebration at the ranch. It seemed like the entire town turned out, filling the property with music and laughter and love. Ethan danced with Julia under the stars, the same stars they had been looking at that night he first told her he was falling for her. "You remember when I was terrified to take this chance on you?" Julia asked as they swayed to the music. "When I thought loving you was too big a risk, I remember. You said you had lost everyone you cared about and did not want to be hurt again. I was such a fool. The only foolish thing would have been not taking that risk, not letting myself love you." She looked up at him, and even at 47 she was as beautiful to him as she had been at 23. "You have given me everything, Ethan Pierce. A home, a family, a love I never dreamed possible." "We gave each other those things," he corrected gently. "You saved me just as much as I saved you that night. More, maybe." They danced until the music ended and their grandchildren demanded their attention, pulling them into games and laughter. And late that night, when everyone had gone home and the ranch was quiet, they sat on their porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the cool spring air, and simply held each other. "Tell me again, Julia requested softly. About the night we met. It had become a tradition between them, a story they told each other on significant occasions, each remembering different details, building the narrative together. I heard a thud against the porch, Ethan began, his voice warm with memory, and then a cough that cut through the wind. I grabbed my rifle and opened the door, and there you were, crumpled against the boards, half frozen. I thought I was dying, Julia continued. I had walked for so long, and I was so cold I could not feel my hands or feet. But then there was light, and this tall man with kind eyes, and I thought maybe I had died and you were an angel. Ethan chuckled. No one has ever mistaken me for an angel. You were my angel. You picked me up so gently, like I was something precious, even though I was a stranger. You brought me inside and wrapped me in blankets and made me warm. I was terrified. I did not know if I had found you in time, if you would survive the night. But you never let me see that fear. You just took care of me and made me feel safe for the first time in months. Julia squeezed his hand. I fell in love with you that night, you know. I did not admit it to myself for weeks, but looking back, I knew even then. I fell in love with you when you smiled at me over breakfast the next morning. That smile just lit up the whole room, and I thought, this woman is remarkable. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. An owl hooted in the distance. The horses shifted in the barn. A coyote howled somewhere out on the plains. It was the symphony of their life together, familiar and beloved. You think about the other path? Julia asked after a while. The one where I did not find your ranch, where I froze out there in the wilderness, sometimes, and it terrifies me. Not just because you would have died, but because I would have continued living my half-life, never knowing what I was missing. Ethan turned to look at her in the moonlight. You were always meant to find your way here, Julia. I believe that. We were meant to find each other. I believe that too. She rested her head on his shoulder. Though I wish the circumstances had been less traumatic. The circumstances do not matter, only the outcome. And the outcome is 25 years of loving you, building a life with you, watching our children grow. I would not change a single thing. As they sat together under the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by the land and the family they loved, both of them felt complete. Their story had begun with desperation and cold and fear, but it had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. A love that had weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and emerged stronger each time. The years continued their steady march. Ethan's hair turned completely gray, then white. Julia developed the laugh lines and soft wrinkles of a life well lived and filled with joy. Their grandchildren grew, and great-grandchildren began to arrive, filling their later years with the chaos and delight of young life. Henry's twins grew into fine ranchers themselves, taking over from their father just as he had taken over from Ethan. Margaret's daughters all pursued education, 2 becoming teachers and 1 a professor at the university in Laramie. Daniel's children showed his same dedication to service, with his son becoming a doctor like his father and his daughter training as a nurse. Through it all, Ethan and Julia remained the heart of the family. Their home was always open, always welcoming. Sunday dinners at the Pierce Ranch became a tradition that no one dared miss, with multiple generations gathering around the expanded table, sharing food and stories and love. On a warm summer evening in 1903, 25 years after their silver anniversary, Ethan and Julia celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. They were 77 and 68 respectively, both slower than they once were, but still active and engaged with life. The celebration was smaller this time, just family, gathered on the porch and in the yard of the ranch house. One of Henry's great-granddaughters, a solemn child of 6 named Lucy, climbed into Julia's lap and asked, "Grandmother Julia, how did you and grandfather Ethan fall in love?" Julia looked at Ethan and they shared a smile full of decades of shared memories. "Well, sweetheart, it was a very cold night in February and I was lost and freezing, and your grandfather found me on this very porch and saved my life." "Like in a fairy tale?" Lucy asked, eyes wide. "Even better than a fairy tale," Ethan said, reaching over to take Julia's hand. "Because it was real." "Tell me the story," Lucy demanded, and soon all the younger children had gathered around, demanding to hear about how their grandparents met. So Ethan and Julia told the story once more, trading off as they always did, filling in each other's details. They told about the stagecoach attack, the desperate walk through the snow, the moment Ethan opened his door. They told about warming by the fire, about the trip into hot springs, about falling in love faster than seemed possible. The children listened with rapt attention, even though many of them had heard the story before. It was a family legend, the foundational story of the Pierce family, and it never got old. And then grandfather asked grandmother to marry him right on the main street of Hot Springs, one of the older children added, having memorized this part. "He did," Julia confirmed. "Without a ring or flowers or any warning, just asked me to marry him right there. And she said yes," Ethan finished. "Best decision either of us ever made." As the evening wore on and the children were called to bed, the adult children lingered, sitting with their parents in the comfortable darkness. Henry sat on the porch steps, his own hair now gray. Margaret leaned against the railing. Daniel occupied the other chair. All three were quiet, simply being present with their parents, knowing without speaking how precious these moments were. "You two set an impossible standard, you know," Margaret said after a while. "Finding true love, staying in love for 50 years, building all of this. How are any of us supposed to measure up?" "You are not supposed to measure up," Julia said gently. "You are supposed to build your own loves, your own lives. Take what worked for us, leave what did not, and make something that is uniquely yours." "But the core of it," Ethan added, "the foundation, that is the same for everyone. Respect, trust, friendship. Being willing to show up every day and choose love even when it is hard, especially when it is hard." "Was it hard often?" Daniel asked. Ethan and Julia exchanged a look. "Sometimes," Julia admitted. "We argued about money, about how to raise you children, about decisions for the ranch. We were two strong-willed people trying to build a life together. Of course it was hard sometimes. But we never went to bed angry," Ethan said. "That was our rule. No matter how upset we were, we would stay up and talk it through until we reached understanding. Sometimes that meant being awake until dawn, but it was worth it. And we never stopped being friends," Julia added. "Even when we were frustrated with each other as spouses, we were still friends who cared about each other's happiness." The conversation drifted to other topics, to memories and family news and plans for the future. But as the night grew late and their children finally departed for their own homes, Ethan and Julia were left alone once more on their porch, as they had been so many times before. 50 years, Julia marveled. Half a century of loving you. "I think I love you more now than I did that night I proposed," Ethan said. "Is that possible, to love someone more after 50 years than you did at the beginning? It is not just possible, it is inevitable if you are doing it right." Julia reached for his hand. "The love at the beginning is intense and passionate, but it is based on potential, on who you hope the other person is. The love after 50 years is based on reality, on knowing someone completely and choosing them anyway. Choosing them because of who they are, flaws and all." "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from you. You have been teaching me about love since the night you found me on this porch." They sat together until the moon rose high overhead, talking and reminiscing, holding hands like the young lovers they had once been. And when they finally went inside to bed, moving slowly with the stiffness of age, they held each other close, grateful for one more day, one more night, one more moment of the life they had built together. The years slowed as they do at the end, but they remained sweet. Ethan and Julia could no longer do as much physically, but their minds remained sharp and their love remained strong. They spent their days sitting on the porch, receiving visits from their extensive family, watching the ranch continue under Henry's capable management, and simply being together. On a cold November morning in 1905, Ethan woke to find Julia had passed quietly in her sleep, her hand still in his, a peaceful expression on her face. She was 70 years old, and she had lived a full and beautiful life, but her loss devastated Ethan in a way nothing else ever had. The funeral was held at the church in Hot Springs, and it seemed the entire town turned out to pay their respects to the woman who had taught their children and grandchildren, who had been a pillar of the community for over a quarter-century. But for Ethan, sitting in the front pew with his children and grandchildren around him, the world had lost its color. That night, his children tried to convince him to stay with one of them, not wanting him to be alone at the ranch. But Ethan refused. "This is where she is," he said simply. "In every room, every corner, every board of this house. I cannot leave her." So they reluctantly let him return to the ranch, though Henry moved into the guest room to keep his father company. And for weeks, Ethan drifted through the house like a ghost, seeing Julia everywhere. In the kitchen where she had made countless meals, in the study where she had worked on her lessons, in their bedroom where they had shared 50 years of nights together. But slowly, gradually, the worst of the grief began to ease. Not the love, never the love, but the sharp edge of loss dulled into something he could bear. He began to find comfort in his memories rather than pain. He could look at Julia's chair by the fire and smile, remembering her sitting there with her mending or a book. He could walk through the garden and remember her tending her plants with such determination, even though half of them always died. One evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Henry joined him. "How are you doing, Pa?" he asked quietly. "I miss her every moment of every day," Ethan said honestly. "But I am grateful. For every single day we had together, for every moment of love. Some people live their whole lives and never know love like what your mother and I shared. I had 50 years of it. How can I be anything but grateful? She loved you so much, I know, and I loved her, still do, always will." Ethan looked at his son. "You take care of Emma, you hear me? Tell her you love her every day, never let her doubt it, not for a moment." "I will, Pa, I promise." Ethan lived for 2 more years after Julia's death, years he spent with his family and his memories. He died peacefully in his sleep on a February night in 1907, almost exactly 29 years after the night he found Julia on his porch. He was 79 years old. They buried him next to Julia in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Hot Springs, under a shared headstone that read, "Ethan Pierce and Julia Vaughn Pierce." A love that began in fire and lasted a lifetime. The ranch stayed in the Pierce family, passing through generations just as the story passed through generations. The tale of the lonely rancher who found a freezing woman on his porch and fell in love with her became a family legend, told and retold, growing more romantic with each telling, but never losing the essential truth at its core. That love could be found in the most unexpected moments. That kindness could change a life. That 2 people who were meant to be together would find their way to each other, even against impossible odds. That a chance encounter on a frozen porch could lead to a love that lasted 50 years and echoed through generations. And on cold February nights, when the wind howled across the Wyoming plains and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. If you stood on that porch and listened carefully, you could almost hear the echoes of their story. The thud of someone collapsing against the weathered boards. The creak of a door opening. The sound of two hearts beginning their journey together. A lonely rancher who found her shivering on his porch, who warmed her with his fire and then his heart, and in return, she gave him everything he had never known he was missing. A home, a family, a love that would outlast them both and live on in the lives they had touched and the family they had built. It was a simple story, really. Two people who found each other when they needed it most, but simple stories can hold the deepest truths. And the truth of Ethan and Julia Pierce was this: love is worth the risk, worth the fear, worth everything. Because when you find the right person, when your soul recognizes its match, nothing else matters except holding on and never letting go. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on the ranch, still tell the story, still stand on that porch and think about the night it all began. The night that changed everything. The night a lonely rancher became lonely no more, and a lost woman found her way home at last.